Hello everyone, and welcome once again to our MOA Live Talk series. Today I'm going to be talking about climate change and archaeology. Before I do so, I would like to send a thank you to Dr. Marie Hoffman, who helped me with some of the research for this talk, to help me save a little bit of time and preparation. So thank you very much, Marie, merci beaucoup, for helping me put this together. So moving forward then, climate change is a hot topic these days. We hear about it in the news, and even more so before our news is dominated by information about our current pandemic. So there were major protests and strikes all over the world last year, and it's also been linked to other significant social movements as well. So climate change is something that has had such a huge impact on our world that no one should really be surprised that there's a relationship with archaeology as well. And in fact, there's several ways in which they interrelate. The first is, obviously, that since archaeology is a way of learning about the past, we can use it to examine climate change, both looking at past episodes like glaciation and deglaciation, and also using archaeological evidence to demonstrate and study the climatic shifts that we're currently undergoing. So as archaeology is primarily about studying past peoples, we don't want to forget the human element either. So we can study how people have reacted to major climatic shifts in the past, and we can also see human processes that have contributed to climate change leading to our present conditions. So let's talk about some specifics. In my talk about archaeobotany, I examined some of the ways that we can use archaeobotanical remains to get an idea of what climate was like in the past. So not only can we see things like what kinds of plants people were actively using, but archaeological deposits can also trap a lot of sort of ambient botanical material like pollen. So we can get an idea of just sort of what kinds of plants were in the area. And so we can use this kind of evidence gathered in soil samples or through pollen cores taken from lakes, for example, to reconstruct past landscapes that people were living in and compare them through time so that we can see changes. For example, the area that I live in around London, Ontario, used to look a lot more like the boreal forest that we see further north than we do today. So there's been a lot of sort of changes in the natural forestation of the area, the kinds of trees we have, and everything that goes along with that. So the other kinds of animals that live in these kinds of environments have changed with those shifts as well. We can also see when non-native species start to show up in environments because their pollen turns up. So even if people aren't using these particular kinds of plants, we can still see that they exist in the environment where previously they did not. So we can also look at zoo archaeology to give us clues about changing climates and landscapes. So over time, we can see what kinds of animal species are occupying an area and how humans are using them. So fish and shellfish are really excellent indicators. Sorry, dog in the background again. A species and variation and even growth rates can be seen in the archaeological record. So disappearance and appearances of fish species with specific ecological niches, as well as overall biodiversity, can tell us about warming and cooling of ocean waters, and the formation of just different estuary environments around river mouths and that sort of thing. So many mollusks, like clams, actually have annual growth rings, kind of like trees, and they can tell us about the kinds and amounts of nutrients that are available in the water, water temperature, and so forth, that are affecting the growth of these animals. And this can also help us sort of understand general climate health questions. But these are just sort of ways to look at the climate itself. And so we do want to look at, or can think about, the human element, as I was saying. So how do people react to climate change? And how do they manage their resources as changes are starting to happen? And so there's actually some really interesting examples of sustainable harvesting that we can see in the archaeological record. This is interesting and relevant because the long stretch of time that we can observe archaeologically can really tell us whether or not these practices actually are sustainable, whether or not they're having the desired impact of preserving biodiversity, keeping different species, and helping preserve the local environment. So we can see basically if these practices are working. So one example that I came across when I was going through the research for this talk was about ducks in this particular lake in Iceland. And I'm not going to try and pronounce its name because I don't speak Icelandic, but I can link the article in the comments in case anyone is interested. So in this case, there's a long-standing tradition into the modern day, with laws to back it up even, that there's this kind of duck that aren't supposed to be hunted, but their eggs are fair game. And so that's to make sure that the breeding population is maintained. So there's still adults who are producing new eggs and new babies, but then you can have a harvest of a certain amount of eggs. And they can actually see this practice projected back well into the past, like hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, looking at the local archaeological sites. So they do find, for example, the duck egg shells in these sites, but they don't find any of the bones from the ducks themselves. However, we can say that this isn't just a matter of the bones not being preserved, or maybe them being prepared elsewhere, because we do find, they do find the bones of other kinds of birds that were being hunted by the peoples of the area. So they can sort of make this correlation between the behavior that they know of in the present and the evidence that they're seeing in the past, and they can see that this is actually an example of the sustainable harvesting. Like, this process has been going on for a very long time, and it's working. So these ducks are still there. They're able to continue those traditional practices, and it's still having the desired impact of maintaining that population in this particular lake. So there's also some really interesting work on studying climate change being done in Arabia, so the Arabic Peninsula between North Africa and Asia, looking at responses to extreme climate change in the past. So the area that we think of now as being pretty arid and desert actually used to be a lot more forested and green area. And what they can see, looking at the archaeological evidence over the region, is that there is evidence that there was major migrations of people as the landscape was no longer able to sustain the kinds of lifestyles that people were used to living, and like sustaining the cultures that they had while they were there. They can also see the development of practices for maintaining oases in the deserts over the long term. So again, there's that element of sustainability that we can see in the archaeological record that demonstrate that the practices that people are using to maintain these environments are sustainable, that they do work. And we can learn from what people are doing and how they've been doing it, and know that these are things that are actually practical, that you can implement, right? So these are things, again, that we can learn from studying human reactions and interactions with this sort of climate changes and whatnot over the course of time. And so we can also see, of course, the impacts of human activity on the environment. So our own contributions to climate change. And this includes lots of different dimensions. So it's not just about like pollution and so forth, but it includes, for example, the introduction of species to new landscapes and the changes that can have on local ecosystems. So maybe a more popular example to use right now is feral hogs. So in North America, they're actually an introduced species. They're domesticated pigs that escaped into the wild and sort of have regressed away from their domesticated versions and sort of become more like wild pigs used to be over time. And they're incredibly destructive to local environments. So they can negatively impact habitats. They can mess up like human agricultural practices as well, and they're just very damaging and destructive. And they're also very successful competitors in these different environments. So they're actually becoming much more common to encounter them, and they're moving as well. So they're expanding their own new habitat. And so that's just one way that we're sort of influencing the climate and the environment. And so these things are linked. So like the amount of species in an area, the biodiversity, impacts the ability of the environment overall to help sustain itself, and impacts how it can help counterbalance some of the other things that are going on in the world, right? So even if we're just looking at things like grazing animals like cattle, so the way that we have to change local environments to support the needs, for example, by driving out native predators and even just clearing land for grazing, for growing hay for them to have forage over the winter, that has an impact also. So there's also other kinds of large-scale agricultural practices that have significant impacts by, again, reducing the amount of biodiversity, so we're losing species, introducing toxins if we're talking about agricultural practices where we're using a lot of pesticides and fertilizers, and it depletes soil quality over time. The kinds of products that are being planted in commercial agriculture and even like small scale farm stuff, they don't really have the same impact as a lot of native species. So like even the grasses that we might grow don't have, for example, the same like depth of a root system that's able to sequester more carbon and clean the air more thoroughly than some kinds of native plants that are being pushed out by our needs to to have these other kinds of agricultural uses of the landscape. So there's also then we get into the construction of infrastructure like dams and roads, highways and railroads, which also again impact animal species, as well as, you know, creating more carbon emissions from people traveling further and just sort of enabling people to live more places across the landscape. But the impact on species also plays an important role in the ecosystems. And all of these things add up to major impacts on the global climate. So these are, you know, they're things probably people have heard said, but I mean, we can see these again archaeologically. We can see these impacts, we can see the spread of people, we can see the changes that are being made, right? And then of course there is the impact of industrialization, which you can see archaeologically in terms of like the things I was saying, its actual impact on the environment, but like, for example, species that reflect the health of marine ecosystems, for example, if we're talking about industrial runoff. But we can also see how the implementation of different cultural systems that support these kinds of activities that continue to have negative impacts on the climate. So one of the examples that I was looking at was the development of textile factories and associated social structures in Massachusetts, where over time you went from a system that was meant to provide jobs for local unmarried women in a context that provided them with places to live and assistance, though it was, you know, it was kind of a paternalistic system. There was still sort of a mutual dependency and maybe more respect. And then over time, this changed to a system that was based on using immigrant labor, where all of the social support systems of the original infrastructure that was associated with these factories were stripped away or allowed to physically decay. So the housing that was provided wasn't maintained anymore, for example. There was none of the social assistance programs that went to providing the original laborers with management of other aspects of their lives, for example. And so all of this was changed basically over a period of about 80 years in the 19th century. And this was a direct response to changing capitalist pressures to produce more in a more competitive social environment over time. And so this included, for example, a greater reliance on coal as well. So there also is the negative impacts on the physical environment. So we can see that these human systems and their responses in the archaeological record can help us understand things that are happening today and why, because a lot of those social pressures are the same that we're experiencing now. And we can also see other things like I mentioned, the migrations being a response to climate change. And we're also seeing that today as climate change is impacting agricultural production in the Middle East. So this is a pattern that's repeating. And so being able to understand what we're seeing in the past helps us understand what we're seeing now, right? And so we're still seeing the pressures of capitalism on the environment and also on social environments. And this contributes again to climate change. And so it's important to have this perspective and be able to understand what we're seeing. So the last part that I wanted to talk about was the impact of climate change on archaeological sites and on the archaeological record. So we know that we're losing ice from glaciers and ice patches across the world. And so places that have been frozen for hundreds or thousands of years are starting to thaw out. And they're revealing more evidence of past human activity from warmer periods in history when they may have been exposed, which is really cool. So in some places, like in Norway, archaeologists have been able to take advantage of this to learn more about the use of these places and the peoples who were using these for travel, for hunting, and so forth, and to get us a better sense of human networks and landscape use in periods where we don't have other good evidence because it's all sort of locked away and sequestered in these frozen ice patches. So there's an article from a few years ago that I've seen actually circulating on Facebook, again more recently, talking about like 2,000 artifacts being recovered around the edges of these ice patches, that it's enabling these kinds of research. And I think that's, it is really cool that they're able to recover and document this kind of material. but it's not all good news, right? So there is a downside, and that's in a lot of places the kinds of cool finds, especially organic materials that are melting out of these ice patches and out of the bases of glaciers, or coming out of other kinds of previously frozen contexts like permafrost. They don't preserve well, or they decay incredibly quickly once they're out of that frozen environment. And they're not all able to be documented and looked after. So we're not really able to fully take advantage of this potential opportunity for learning. So in fact, what's happening is we're losing a lot of this archaeological material and these archaeological sites and our ability to gain insights from them. So the same processes that we're seeing in Norway are seen as much more tragic and problematic in Greenland because they don't really have the kind of human infrastructure to manage everything that's being exposed. So they don't have the ability to go out and record all these finds in situ and document them and preserve or save any of them. So a lot of that material is actually just being lost. And there's also the matter of coastal erosion, which is we're not only losing archaeological sites because they're being washed away or they're falling into the ocean and they're like losing context and actual materials just being destroyed, which is all very unfortunate. But a lot of these sites, these coastal sites especially, are exactly the kinds of sites that would otherwise preserve information about changes in maritime environments that would allow us to study the availability of past resources and understand climate change through them. So it also impairs our ability to see things like sustainable harvest practices and other human impacts and adaptations to these changes. So it's not necessarily just about the loss of the sites, but that data itself, like that specific kind of information we could get from those particular sites, would be especially valuable to understanding and studying climate change because they relate to, I mean, when we're talking about coastal sites, we're talking about people who are using coastal resources. And so those are the kinds of places we're going to find good shell middens, people who are collecting a lot of marine resources like fish and shellfish, which really can tell us a lot of information, as I was saying before, about the health of the climate and changing like ocean temperatures and all these kinds of things that are really important to understanding climate change and to seeing human patterns of adaptation, right? So this brings us to something else that I really hadn't thought about before, but actually came up during my research and I found really exciting, actually. And that's the idea that archaeological legacy collections, so materials from archaeological sites that have already been excavated, actually already contain a wealth of this kind of climatic data. From old soil samples, pollen cores, old paleobotanical remains, faunal materials, and even just the human cultural materials that provide insights on past climate, human impacts, adaptations, and everything else that I've been talking about here. So also archaeological sites, or as archaeological sites are lost to climate change, this past work is really what is left in some of these places to help us make any kinds of new interpretations about past peoples and their behaviors. So that's really, you know, part of it is really cool that we have this material, right? Even though it might be what is left for us to be able to use to make interpretations. So for that to be the case, though, for us to be able to use it, it has to be an investment in the care of the actual archaeological record past the initial process of like creating your first reports and whatnot. And so places like the Museum of Ontario Archaeology provide an environment where these things can be cared for. But there's like an overall in the industry across the board, lack of financial planning and investment in the care of or the long-term care of collections, and also issues of accessibility to these older legacy collections that do impact our ability to study and understand climate change as well as the human past more broadly. So then just to review quickly, archaeology can help us understand both past and present episodes of climate change on various scales. It can also help us to study human reactions and human impacts. So there's a lot of information that is currently available in legacy collections and older archaeological assemblages, as long as that material is cared for and is accessible. So while in some cases climate change is revealing new sites and finds that are able to generate understandings of past peoples and their environments, it's also exposing elements of the archaeological record to loss and destruction, which just increases the value of those legacy collections and increases our responsibility to care for it responsibly, which is a bit redundant, but you get the point. So thank you, everyone. Next week we're going to be talking about pseudo-archaeology on Tuesday, and I'm hoping that I'm going to have another prepared talk for you on Thursday, possibly about the Lawson site from Dr. Ferris. So if you would like to help us contribute to our ability to care for the valuable legacy collections and archaeological materials in our care, please do consider donating to the museum via our donations page, which I will again link in the comments. And thanks again to Marie for helping me out with some of the research for this talk. And thank you, and have a great afternoon.